Welcome to Richplanet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. In the past, Richplanet has covered the subject of UFOs and related subjects in dozens of shows. A new book by researcher Andrew Johnson looks into the UFO issue. His book attempts to give answers to such questions as: have aliens visited us? What do they look like? Where do they come from? Why are they here? What historical evidence exists to show that aliens have been involved in the evolution or the creation of humans? Is there an alien or UFO cover-up? If so, how is it kept in place? Andrew's book includes over 900 references and aims to give the reader a perspective on alien intervention, alien abduction, alien contact, landings and crashes. The involvement of military and intelligence interests and their influence on the so-called disclosure movement is also discussed. Welcome back, Andrew Johnson.
Thanks for inviting me back, Richard. It's good to be here again.
And as you may have noticed, I'm sporting the shitty blue fleece and Andrew's sporting the shitty black t-shirt.
Yes, well, I mean, the whole fleece thing has become like an alien life form. It's taken on a life of its own, and my particular fleece may very well have to be rehomed. I'm not sure at this point. And even this morning I received an email from somebody saying that they liked my choice in fleeces. So you know, it's and I was kind of I didn't know what to think of you calling it the Shitty Blue Fleece Tour. It was an interesting choice of title from my perspective. So yeah, it's definitely taken a life of its own. Yeah,
so these are very warm, and winter is coming, so you can buy them from the Richplanet website, and also, as Andrew is sporting, the Richplanet polo shirt.
Absolutely.
So you can get those and other products from Richplanet's website.
I never expected that Richard would be starting a boutique, but maybe that's on the cards for the future. I don't know.
All right. Now, this is Andrew's new book, which is very interesting. And obviously, it's how many pages?
It's about 430 pages, I think, something like that.
We can't cover the entire content, but I've picked out some of the interesting parts. And as I was reading it, what came to my mind is that you've got all what you consider to be the best UFO information, and you've gone through it with an Occam's razor, or as I'm calling it, Johnson's razor, right? And you've included some evidence which you think is less solid, but you've said why that is, and the evidence which you think is far better for evidence of extraterrestrials on Earth. You've gone into it in a lot of detail.
Yes.
So there's information because I've got 2 whole shelves full of UFO books next door, right? So there's no way you can include that, although you do have 900 references in there. You've included what you believe to be the best evidence, and we're going to go through some of that today. And you've split the book into 2 sections, so you've separated out crop circles, which I think is possible. Maybe doesn't even belong in a UFO/alien book, possibly, right? But I don't know whether we will reach that section today. Yeah. But we did discuss that in a previous show. But you've added to that significantly in this book.
Yeah. Right.
A lot more information than we covered in the previous crop circle show. Yeah. All right. So let's start off then. So your interest in UFOs began when you were quite young. You had some sightings, and you also met the famous UFO researcher Tony Dodd when you were young.
Yes.
So tell us first about the meeting that you had with former police officer Tony Dodd.
Yes, well, that came about as a result of I had my first sighting when I was about 10 years old, so that wasn't connected to the Tony Dodd encounter particularly, really. But that was one of the things that sparked my interest, and I go into that in the first chapter of the book. What happened was I decided to do my A-level general studies project on UFOs, basically. And when I was discussing this with the teachers, I think it was my form tutor at the time, it was called Mr. Jones, and I actually met him in Skipton one time when I was on a return visit, probably about at least 20 years ago, maybe longer. And he actually lived across the road from Tony Dodd. And when my English teacher learned that I was doing this project, he said, "Oh, you should go and see this chap who lives across the road from me, because he's got the weirdest stories, you know." And I looked at his face when he was saying this, and I could tell that he didn't really. He knew that Tony was a serious-minded person, you know, and not to come out with these strange stories just as a fantasy, because as I soon found out that Tony Dodd was a police officer, and he was still a serving police officer when I met him, which was probably 1982 when I first met him. And he actually gave me some information about some of the cases he was investigating at that time.
Now, you've had 4 sightings yourself, which you go into in the book. And in the mid-2000s, you found out about the Disclosure Project, which we've discussed on the show before. This is covered in many shows. So this was it started off as documents put together by Dr. Stephen Greer of people in military and intelligence giving inside knowledge or inside information on the UFO phenomenon. And so I can recommend that people watch the 2-hour video that was produced by the Disclosure Project, or there's a 4-hour version, and there's also a briefing document. And the point that we were making is that neither of us knew about it when it happened, which is significant because it was at the Washington DC Press Club, and it was obviously those who were organising it and involved in it thought it was going to change the whole world. They thought huge things were going to come of it. There was going to be a massive worldwide UFO disclosure, and everyone was going to understand that UFOs were real, blah, blah, blah. But, a watershed moment. So you point to a BBC website where it's mentioned, and it's played down, really. Yeah,
I mean, what struck me and how I got into it all was especially that, as you mentioned, the BBC report, which I mentioned in the book. And, we had this event, there were military people, there was John Callaghan, who used to be the head of the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority. As I said at interviews at the time, we're not talking about somebody walking their dog down the street who sees a bright light in the sky. You had John Callaghan with the radar evidence from the Japan Airlines case from 1986. And yet the BBC article describes that as saying UFO spotters slam cover-up. These people were reduced to UFO spotters, not Federal Aviation Chief, describes evidence for UFO encounter with Japanese Airlines in 1986. That wasn't in the BBC report. So I knew at that point, and this is the key point of bringing this up, I knew there was a cover-up. Up until that point, I'd only suspected that there might be, but by that time, when I saw that BBC report of the event 2 years prior to when I discovered it, I knew there was a cover-up.
Yeah, but you weren't sure of what? You weren't sure of whether it's a cover-up of alien life visiting the Earth, or whether it's secret military craft or something else.
Right. And what was the key point, I've probably said this in interviews we've done in the past, but it's worth reiterating briefly here, is that Stephen Greer at the time made the connection between the free energy issue and the UFO issue, in essence saying, well, if we agree that these physical metallic craft are coming here to land, what is their power system? And he was arguing that they had a power system and that it had been back-engineered, and that the benefit to the rest of us would be to understand how these back-engineered power systems worked, so that we could use it as a source of energy to power our factories and everything. And that I hadn't heard of that before Greer, and so that was what really triggered me into renewed interest.
And that is a case that you make in the book, that it's not necessarily the cover-up of alien life that they're bothered about. It's the cover-up of energy technology and weapons-related technology, yes, and which in the black world may be linked.
Yes.
Yes. So energy, the vacuum, and what we term atoms or matter, right? We think that in the black world they've got a different understanding of those three things and how they interact with each other, and they've mastered it far more than white science, and that's what they're worried about. That's what they want to keep in the black. And the UFO subject is a pathway to that, which is why the UFO subject is disinformed upon and fun is made of it, etc. Whether aliens exist or not. Yeah, have I?
Yeah, that's exactly what my take on it. In that, yeah. So the UFO issue is used to keep the truth about energy and weapons technology developed in the black world and the black, call it black physics or ether physics. And there's various, names you could give to that. That comes in strongly into the UFO field, so they need to manage the knowledge of those things, and that's why there is a muddle up and a cover up among UFO researchers, which we'll talk a bit more about and give a few examples as we go through this.
Yeah, well, can you give the example of a 2003 Daily Mail article which illustrates how the perception management of the UFO subject works?
Right, yeah, that's one that I just included from my archives because that happened around the time I was getting interested again. And this was to do with the Rendlesham Forest case, which we're probably going to do. I think Richard's going to do, you're going to do another program on that at some point, aren't you?
At some point, yes.
Yeah. So, but in this particular case, this reporter, I think, was called David Hanlon, Michael Hanlon. It's in the book anyway. So he'd written this article claiming that this Kevin Conn character had driven a police car around the base with a light on top, and that's what had created the entirety of the Rendlesham incident. And then he said that a helicopter had landed in the woods, and that's what people saw. So I made the argument in this particular chapter that this Michael Hanlon, he wasn't really interested in the truth of what happened at Rendlesham. It was just as easy for him to say, oh, they just mistook a helicopter landing for a UFO landing. He didn't actually bother to go and check that a helicopter had been reported landing, or whose helicopter it was, whether it belonged to what base it belonged to, or whether it was a civilian helicopter or whatever it was. He didn't bother to investigate that. He just assumed that it was a helicopter. That was the most likely explanation, and there was no point in talking about anything to do with a UFO of any other type landing.
Mm-hmm. And the key point is that it's that story that reaches a national daily newspaper, not interviews from the actual witnesses.
Right. So the statements of witnesses are not really covered in any sufficient detail, and when they put forward a story about it being the lighthouse or something like that, as in the example of Rendlesham, it's never explained as to why it couldn't have been the lighthouse. Mm-hmm.
So in your book you discuss different types of people, so agnostics, believers, skeptics and knowers. So can you explain them and why they are important to distinguish between in this subject?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like that with a lot of similar subjects that we cover, in that, you have people who have no interest at all. They don't want to look at things. They're just, more interested in football or whatever. And, seemingly you're always going to have those people. Then you have, for example, people who might have seen an odd light in the sky, which has piqued their curiosity. So they've seen a strange light travelling at high speed, or moving in an unusual way and stopping and starting and that sort of thing in a way that an aircraft or a helicopter doesn't do. So they might have an interest and they won't dismiss the phenomenon out of hand, but they've never really explored it to the depth that you and I have. And then you have somebody who's had an experience, and you might categorise somebody like Travis Walton. So he had an experience and he knows certain things. And then obviously you have skeptics and debunkers who want to say that anything that people like Travis Walton says, or John Callahan says, or anyone, it must be false. They must be either bad observers or they must have some mental problem, because what they describe can't be fitted in with a standard reductionist worldview of the only things that fly are rockets, and the only way of travelling is by cars and trains and boats and so forth. And there's no such thing as anti-gravity propulsion because it's been looked at before and it's never been made viable, so therefore it doesn't exist and it's not possible to do it. That would be my characterisation of a skeptic reductionist.
And you have a problem with believers.
Yes, yeah. So there are the other people who believe that something's happened to them, but they've never sort of gone further and tried to explore what actually happened and get to the bottom of it. So you can have a belief, you do have this religious element to the UFO research community, that people will believe that they've had a certain experience, but they won't get down to what actually happened. They'll stay at the belief level rather than finding evidence to support what may or may not have happened to them. And then you get speakers going around the circuits talking about their contacts with aliens, and they won't really go much beyond that, and wonder where is this contact really coming from? What's the source? What's the motivation behind this intelligence contacting me? Is there a motivation? They tend to stop short of those sorts of questions, and I do explore some of those questions and those attitudes in the book as well.
Now, you give some quotes from US presidents, and there's a surprisingly large number of presidents have either been involved with or made comments about the UFO subject. So can you give us a little bit on that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, certainly Truman, he was quoted in a Nick Cook 2005 documentary, Harry Truman, that he had meetings mentioning flying saucers all the time. He actually said, we've got a film clip of him saying that. And so not a lot of people are aware of that. So the UFO subject has been of interest to US presidents. And of course, Jimmy Carter had a sighting I think in the 1960s with several other people, and he filed a UFO report. And then, of course, perhaps more well known are the comments of Ronald Reagan. And then you have comments from Clinton. And Clinton he actually had this meeting at a ranch with Lawrence Rockefeller, and Grant Cameron got these pictures of Hillary Clinton shaking hands with Lawrence Rockefeller, and she was holding a book which was identified as Paul Davis's book about extraterrestrial life. So they definitely had conversations about the subject back in the 1990s. But some people, for example, think that the Clintons, are going to or were going to give out information,
or wanted to,
and maybe they did. But we have to remember that the Clintons are essentially criminals, and anyone that wants to look into the issue of tainted blood, for example, can find out what sort of people the Clintons are. So what I'm saying is that just because a political leader, whether they're American or British or whatever nationality, says that they're interested in disclosing the truth about UFOs, doesn't mean that they're a truthful person generally, and that they're a good person. Right. They can have still done horrible things, which it seems to be the case with the Clintons from my research, and they claiming they want to tell the truth about UFOs. The other one that's really interesting is when Obama was on the Jimmy Kimmel show in, I think it was 2015, I forget the exact date. And Jimmy Kimmel had Bill Clinton on, he'd had Hillary Clinton on, and he'd asked them the question about the UFO secrecy. He'd asked them all the same question.
The moment I was inaugurated, my hand it'd still be hot from touching the Bible, and I would immediately race to wherever they have the files about Area 51 and UFOs, and I'd go through everything to find out what happened. Right. Did you do that?
That's why you will not be president. That's the first thing that you would do.
It's at
the aliens won't let it happen. You reveal all their secrets. They exercise strict control over us.
If you read the clip, it's made as a joke and everyone's laughing. The whole studio is in stitches, But if you actually look at the literal words that he says, what is the meaning of? Why would he say that?
All right. Although many presidents have been known to comment and made serious comments, none of them have actually made a proper public disclosure. That's never happened.
No.
Now, and we think that's due to black technology.
Yes.
Now, in 2008, the UK government started to release so-called UFO files, which I've covered in the past, which were drip-fed out over a number of years. But they, there was nothing top secret in them. It was predominantly just reports that people had filled in and sent to the Ministry of Defence. There wasn't anything revealing in those files that people didn't already know.
No, that's right. As you say, there were maybe, there are a few reports that probably came out that people hadn't seen, like RAF pilots had seen an object while they were on missions. There might have been one or two things like that. but there was no type of disclosure that there has been an official group, like, for example, you know, that you've covered with the contact that you saw, saying this group 8, group 5-8.
Yeah, the group, group 5-8, which I suspect it was a special forces group made up of 5-8 Field Squadron Regiment. Right?
Yeah. So I mean, we had no acknowledgement that anything like that of any kind was ever sanctioned by the British government or the US government. None of that type of disclosure has come out in any official documents.
Yeah, there was no admission of any of their own activities.
No, that's what I mean.
And other countries were doing the same. So we could ask the question, was that some sort of worldwide initiative, this UFO files being released?
Yeah, that's what I sort of put together in the book. There seemed to be, you know, this was being done in parallel in several different countries between, I think, about 2006 and 2008. I mean, maybe it was to do with just the timing of the development of the internet, such that things, you know, many more people by 2008 had got quite good, you know, high-speed internet access. So it was possible for them to diffuse some of the interest in the UFO subject and stop all these letters pouring into government departments by just releasing the documents and putting them on various websites and saying, that's everything we have, we're going to deny everything else, just go and look at those documents and go away. You know, that's maybe all it was.
I think the UK effort was an administrative move in order to make it easier for them by putting the files in an archive for people to see, rather than having to answer hundreds of FOI requests, because it's a popular subject that people ask questions about.
Yes.
Now, there have been formal investigations. Some information has been published by governments, and so in the USA, in the 40s and 50s, we've had Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, that was the 1960s, and later the Condon Report. So people can research those if you want to.
That's right, and there was an earlier one which I came across called Project Saucer, which actually was the first one, which is an interesting title. I think that was in 1948, so that was just before, I think, Project Sign. I think Project Saucer turned into Project Sign, and I wasn't aware of that until I'd, you know, been sort of putting together this book. So yeah.
Yeah, and there were congressional hearings which took place in the USA in 1966 and 68. So the French government did their own investigation into UFOs and produced a report in 1999 entitled The Committee Report, UFOs and Defence, What Must We Be Prepared For? And it has a fascinating conclusion, which I'll just read out.
Yes.
It states that the UFO problem, so this is a government which is stating this, the UFO problem cannot be eliminated by mere caustic and offhand witticisms. Studies have been done that demonstrate the most certain physical reality of completely unknown flying objects with remarkable flight performances and noiselessness, apparently operating by intelligent beings. Secret craft, definitely of earthly origin, drones, stealth aircraft, etc., can only explain a minority of cases. If we go back far enough in time, we clearly perceive the limits of this explanation. A single hypothesis sufficiently takes into account the facts and, for the most part, only calls for present-day science. It is the hypothesis of extraterrestrial visitors. A model of magnetohydrodynamic technology, which could be employed to propel the UFOs in the atmosphere, has been well developed. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is far from the best scientific hypothesis. It certainly has not been categorically proven, but strong presumptions exist in its favour, and if it is correct, it is loaded with consequences. So they're leaving it open there. They're saying that there's definitely things in the sky which have unexplicable dynamics. But is it suggesting that they might be man-made that the French government doesn't know about?
I think that's what's implied. If you know, you can read that conclusion, and yes, I think that's what's implied in that they're saying yes. It seems to be a combination of stealth type programs and some type of extraterrestrial technology. Now, that report was written by a sort of panel of experts from the aerospace industry, and it was given to the the French government. I'm not sure if it's accurate to say that the people involved worked for the government, but they were paid, to produce that report by the government. And I think there were one or two government people involved in it, but it was never officially translated into English. That translation was done unofficially and published on the internet, I think in the early 2000s. And it was a chap, I think, called Bernard Thuniel, who runs a magazine in France. He was given a copy of the report to publish in his magazine. I don't think it was generally discussed in the French press, nor was it discussed outside of France very much. And in fact, as Leslie Kane will tell you, who was a reporter, a US reporter, she tried to get a report about that published, and she wrote to all the mainstream US papers, and they didn't want to know. The Boston Globe eventually published a report about it in, I think, early 2000 or something. So again, it was a serious report, but it wasn't seriously reported in any of the world's media, to my knowledge.
It suggests there's some sort of D-notice or ridicule notice on the subject, that there's a rule that they have to make fun of it.
Yes. I mean, of course, we just mentioned very briefly here that now seems to be changing to some extent, as we've, with all this latest thing with the To the Stars Academy and the Louis Elizondo stuff. So we obviously were aware of that, and you've done programs and talks about that in the past. So maybe we'll get onto that later, but I just wanted to insert that here.
Now, you think that the issue of UFOs is linked to 9/11. So I'm just going to quote from your book, Andrew.
Okay.
You say that one aspect of this, which I have already written up extensively in 3 of my other books, is the truth about what happened on 9/11. Leslie Kean, like Stephen Greer, Steve Bassett, Nick Pope and many others, have not yet publicly stated that the cover-up about the UFO ET issue is unquestionably related in some way to the cover-up of what happened on 9/11. This is perhaps the acknowledgement that is needed if we wish to learn more about the truth regarding UFOs, aliens and the like. So can you explain that, Andrew?
Yes, I mean, that's essentially, I say that probably a few times in the book, really to make the point that a lot of people are quite comfortable talking about, and you and I have done programs on this whole thing, about the various technologies for propulsion being developed and all these various methods. And even in that Cometa report you mentioned about magnetohydrodynamics, which I think was Townsend Brown was working on that in the 50s. So a lot of the UFO researchers are happy to talk about that side of things, and maybe they've got some type of a propulsion system developed and an energy system developed. But what about weapons? What about weapons technology? And I say in the book, and I've said it elsewhere, I've said it in the 9/11 books as well, one of the clear links to me seems to be this Science Applications International Corporation, big US defense contractor, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, I think, in the US. They were consultants to NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, to produce their reports about the destruction of the World Trade Center. And the time that I'd heard of SAIC before I heard about their connection to NIST was out of the mouth of Stephen Greer, because he said that one of his disclosure witnesses, I think was Denise McKenzie was her name, I mentioned it in the book, she had said that Science Applications International Corporation were big benefactors of the black budget, and this was in relation to the study of UFO technology.
Let me just interject, Andrew, there, because there's 2 things I think we need to make clear in this. Firstly, the World Trade Center complex was destroyed with a directed energy weapon, right? That's been proven for many years now in Dr. Judy Wood's book, right? The World Trade Center complex was destroyed with a directed energy weapon. SAIC are known to carry out research into directed energy weapons, and they helped write the report
Correct.
of the 9/11 Commission report on what happened there.
Right.
But they've also made comments about or are involved with other types of technology linked to the UFO field.
Right.
So carry on, Andrew.
Absolutely. No, that's great, and that's exactly what the point that I'm making, and you've added to that substantially. And so SAIC, one of their other specialities is running psychological operations. Again, there's a YouTube documentary about their role of running psychological operations in Iraq following the American invasion. And so this is something that UFO researchers won't talk about. None of them I think that you and I are probably the only two people who bring up this SAIC UFO 9/11 connection, if you want to call it that, however you want to label it. It is undeniable. It's in the documentation, and I think when you see some of the aspects of the technology which was used to destroy the World Trade Center, as documented by Dr. Judy Wood, you can see how it relates to energy, which then relates to how, for example, the flying saucer propulsion mechanisms appear to operate using some technique of field propulsion and some type of anti-gravity. And those aspects have come up in the evidence from the destruction of the World Trade Center.
So can you just highlight again SAIC's connection to the UFO subject?
Well, that was mentioned by Stephen Greer. He mentions it in a testimony by, I think, does say Denise McKenzie. Greer also talks about SAIC in relation to what Bobby Ray Inman said, because Bobby Ray Inman, who I think was former deputy director of the CIA, he was also involved with Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, in other words. So Greer mentions that connection there as well. I mentioned that in the book.
Mm-hmm. If you want to learn a bit more about SAIC and its possible involvement in 9/11, you can watch Chris Hampton's film.
It's called 9/11 Alchemy. Yes, that's a very good document of
9/11 Alchemy. Now, you've got a chapter on entertainment, and entertainment's how much it's used the UFO and alien subject in songs and in films, such as The Forbidden Planet in 1956, which is a very interesting film to analyse.
It is, yes.
And Close Encounters. And the film E.T., in which you make a very interesting claim, which is that Bill Cooper, he thought that the E.T. film was a retelling of a military story, and that it was based on a true story, and the boy in E.T. who meets the extraterrestrial, he is a metaphor for an Air Force officer who had been working with a real E.T. in captivity, if you like. That's what Bill Cooper claims.
That's right, and it's a very interesting account, which I heard, again, I think it was through Grant Cameron's website originally, that basically the story of the E.T. film, the 1980 Spielberg film, that was basically a true story, but as you say, the little boy wasn't the little boy in the real story, he was an Air Force officer, and Cooper told this account in 1989, and I think Spielberg had made some comments in the early 80s, soon after the film came out, but I haven't been able to trace those exact comments, but I'll get onto that in a minute. But so Cooper had said that a saucer had crashed in the late 1940s or early 1950s, I think in New Mexico somewhere, and they went out to the site and they found this alien walking around, and there were a couple of dead ones as well. And so the Air Force officer had to befriend this alien and pump it for information, and this went on for about 2 or 3 years, and eventually the alien died, according to Cooper, and they sent out a message, but before it died, to try and say to the extraterrestrials, come to the Earth because we've got your friend or your whatever, and we can't make him well. We need your help. And this was called Project Sigma, according to Cooper. But the curious thing is that in a 2011 interview, Steven Spielberg was interviewed by somebody called Quint. I don't know his real name, and I quote the audio in the book. The audio is online. I've got it in a trailer video that I made about the book. And Steven Spielberg says that he went to the White House with Nancy and Ronald Reagan present, and a few other people. He thinks Neil Armstrong might have even been there. And they showed the E.T. film. Spielberg was invited by Reagan to show the film. They showed the film.
It was in the White House screening room.
Yeah.
And Reagan got up to thank me for bringing the film to show to show the president, the first lady, and all of their guests, which included Sandra Day O'Connor in her first week as a justice of the Supreme Court, and it included some astronauts. I think Neil Armstrong was there. I'm not 100% certain, but it was an amazing evening, and he just stood up and he looked around the room almost like he was doing a head count, and he said, "I want to thank you for bringing E.T. to the White House. We really enjoyed your movie." And then he looked around the room and he said, "And there are a number of people in this room who know that everything on that screen is absolutely true."
And Spielberg says that Reagan kind of said it as if it was a joke, but he wasn't laughing, and you could see that he was saying it as a serious remark. And he said that about 6 people in the room knew that it was true. So we have the 1989 Cooper story saying that the film is based on a true story, and we have Spielberg claiming in 2011 that that's what Reagan said. So I found that very interesting.
We are going to come on to some of the retrieval cases, or alleged retrieval cases, a little bit later. Right, I'll read another quote. As US Air Force NRO operative Sergeant Dan Morris, who sometimes used the name Dan Salter, stated in an interview with Stephen Greer, UFOs are both extraterrestrial and man-made. It is not that our government doesn't want us to know that there are people on other planets. What the people in power don't want us to know is that this free energy from energy generators developed with UFO technology is available to everybody. So secrecy about the UFO issue is because of the energy issue. When this knowledge is found out by the people, they will demand that our government release this technology, and it will change the world. Just to reiterate, he's not mentioning weapons there.
No.
Which we think it should be.
I think that a lot more researchers should be looking at that as an issue, because that's another way of having supremacy over other powers, is to have weapons technology at your disposal. So if you've got advanced energy technology and advanced weapons technology, then you're basically unassailable.
Now, in trying to get to the bottom of this issue, you use the term conventional evidence, which is what a scientist at a university would consider, or an organisation like SETI, who look at distant star systems to see if there's any planets like the Earth that might support life, or they look for signals. And that's all well and good, taking that hardline scientific approach. But tell us why you don't think that's good enough in order to actually get to the truth of this issue, just to go by this, what you would call conventional evidence.
Well, I mean, you essentially what you and I, when I get onto that part, I talk about my correspondence with Seth Shostak, for example, and I pointed out to Seth Shostak in an email in I think 2004. I think I sent this to him, and I got his response that Gordon Cooper, who was a Mercury astronaut, said that he filmed a flying saucer landing at Edwards Air Force Base in 1955, I think it was. Just
to interrupt you, Andrew. Seth Shostak, this article is published on space.com, so he would be considered a mainstream. Is he a scientist or a journalist?
He's a scientist, I believe,
right.
Yes. He worked for the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which was beaming out radio signals, receiving radio signals and then processing them to see if they had an artificial element to any of them.
Right, and at this current point in time, as far as they're concerned, there's been no contact with extraterrestrials. So you were pointing out to him the Gordon Cooper story. So
correct.
Continue.
Yeah, exactly. So going back to the conventional evidence is, we listen for these radio signals coming in. There's got to be civilizations out there sending these radio signals, so we'll read everything in, we'll process it in our computers, and we'll pick out the artificial signals. And that's the conventional approach. But if you've got a recognised military figure like Gordon Cooper, who's been in the space program, admittedly when this incident happened, he wasn't in the space program because it hadn't been started yet. When you've got him talking about this thing landing at Edwards Air Force Base, apparently under intelligent control, you should at least be interested in that as a person who is doing a project looking for extraterrestrial intelligence. But he just said, I'm not going to talk about that. He completely ignored it.
I can read his quote. So you've told him that there's testimony from an astronaut who was serving for many years, a trustworthy character, someone who's believed to be trustworthy by people like people in the mainstream.
Yeah.
And he's talking about a film of a UFO that landed and was documented at a US air base. So Shostak replied to you in 2005, as for your suggestion that, one, we should believe testimony when it's given by astronauts, and 2, SETI should broaden its scope. I won't address the former, as it suggests that just because someone is trained to fly the space shuttle, their word is a substitute for objective scientific evidence. Right, so in other words, he's going to reject the testimony from anyone unless they're a scientist. That's what he's saying there. That's silly, and it's not science. As for 2, it is not SETI's mission to investigate claims of sightings of alien craft around the Earth. We do a different experiment, one that could be quickly checked by any number of observers and observatories. If I suggested that MUFON, for instance, should broaden its activities and do detailed radio searches of F through K star systems, would you think that a major desideratum? I suspect not. So he's saying we've got to ignore everyone unless they're a scientist, and he's saying that we're not going to use other people's methods. We're just going to use this one narrow method to try and prove or find out evidence.
That's essentially what he's saying. You know, he's saying I don't want to look at any other potential methods because this is the only method that I believe is valid to establish an answer to the question of whether extraterrestrial life has visited the Earth. And in fact, he's not even going to answer that question. He's really only interested in trying to answer a question of whether there is any evidence of an extraterrestrial civilization sending a signal out into space. He's limiting himself to that question. So, and this is often the way that mainstream academia works, is they will limit their scope of study to deliberately and ignore anything which answers the question in another way.
Yeah, and just to stay on mainstream thinking, a classic debunking question, which is often used, you'll hear them say it all the time, is that, well, if an alien travels all the way, firstly, it's not possible to travel that far because you can't exceed the speed of light. That's the first thing they'll say. And then they'll say, well, they travel all this way and then their UFO crashes on the Earth, right? So, but we'll come on to that second point a bit later. But with regards to the assumption that they're traveling from another star, when I've looked at the UFO subject, I don't make that assumption.
No.
Right? I think there is certainly testimony. Now, you can question some of the hard evidence for there being non-human intelligence either on the planet or visiting the planet or on the planet in the past. And I like to leave it there. A non-human intelligence doesn't say where they're from, doesn't say how they get here, doesn't say whether they're even physical, right? Is there a non-human intelligence presence, right? We don't know how. It could be some completely unknown way that intelligence gets here. But is there a non-human intelligence that is interacting with the human race? That's a much broader question than is there a green man in a flying saucer that's setting off and for hundreds of light years he goes into suspended animation and then makes his long journey here and then crashes his UFO, right? We're not saying that.
No.
Right?
No.
So the Earth is a massive place. If you look at the volume of the Earth, there's a lot of room inside the Earth. I don't know what's inside it. I've never been inside of the Earth. There's a lot of room in our own solar system. We don't know that there's not bases on other bodies in our own solar system. So that would counteract the argument for them travelling all that way. Because no scientist would argue that it's not possible to travel from another planet to our planet.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. And that's, holding up this other book, Secrets in the Solar System, one might make that case that within this book there is evidence from our own space program which suggests that there is evidence of intelligent life within the solar system, or rather perhaps I might say the activities of intelligent life within the solar system. That's the case that I try and make in this book. And as you say, that then precludes the question of, well, they've come from a distant galaxy or a distant star system. They may not have come that far.
And I think the evidence in that book suggests largely that that's been in the past.
Yes.
Not necessarily now, although there may be evidence for now, but I think there's evidence of archaeology in the solar system. Yeah,
that's what I think.
There are a number of books being written about the Roswell incident, and you go into the Roswell incident because you think this is one case which is possibly evidence of a genuine non-human intelligence that has visited the Earth or got to the Earth somehow. So what books do you recommend and why?
Well, I actually mainly recommend the Paul Davies film, which was the 1994 TV movie called Roswell, which I think you can get on DVD off Amazon. It's an excellent summary, in my view, of the Roswell case, and some of it is dramatised to kind of smooth out the storytelling. But I think that based on what I've heard about the various witnesses, it covers their accounts very well. And I think that the other books that you can read are Don Smith's Witness to Roswell, where he's collected 600 witness accounts. I mean, by all means, of course, read Stanton Friedman's original book, Crash at Corona, from 1978, where he brought out some of the early details.
So let me just interrupt you. Unless you're going to read all those books and watch that film, and you're just going to read a little article on the BBC website and say, oh, it was just a psyop, it was a balloon, it was dummies, it was whatever, right? You can't debunk it unless you've looked at the information that Andrew's quoting here.
And what I highlight in the book, because I found it very, very intriguing, was the story of June Crane, which is one of the slightly lesser known cases.
Right. Well, before you do that, Andrew, what I'll do, I'm going to give a timeline of some of the key points of what happened at Roswell for those who don't know, and then you can tell me about June Crane. So on the 8th of July 1947, the Roswell Daily Record reported that the US Army had recovered pieces of a flying disc which had crashed on Mac Brazel's ranch at Corona near Roswell. Around the same time, UFOs and saucers had been seen in the area. On the 9th of July 1947, the US Army changed its story, stating the debris recovered was only a weather balloon. Over time, many more witnesses came forward and spoke of there being 2 crash sites, recovery of living and dead bodies, recovery of unusual pieces of metal, such as the impervious but light and flexible memory metal, which returned to its original shape after being scrunched or folded up, and it was impossible to cut, I think, as well.
Yes.
Witnesses stated the debris and bodies were flown to Wright Field, Ohio, now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Defense Secretary James Forrestal was involved in the events and is said to have communicated with one or more of the aliens from the crashed craft. One of the aliens survived until 1954. So that's a basic, simple summary of what happened. So tell us about this lady.
So one of the things that is there is this alleged memory metal, or the metal that was very light and then, returned to its sort of flat shape when you scrunched it up or cut it or tried to cut it or bent it. And there, David Rudiak has a site called Roswell Proof, and I recommend people visit that site because I think he's got about 20 accounts of people who apparently handled this morphing metal, one of which is June Crane, and I go into some detail in the book because there is an audio recording of an interview with her by James Clarkson, and that was published, I think, in the early 2000s, and James Clarkson was a former police detective, and again, that's an account, for example, that is recorded, as I said. So, for example, you could get Peter Hyatt or a statement analyst to look at it and detect deception. But certainly in listening to that account, the way she describes it, there is no reason for that woman to have told a lie about handling this memory metal. It didn't serve her interest. She didn't want to tell the story at first. In fact, she came and saw a lecture by James Clarkson, I think in 95 or 96. And then the Air Force produced this final report on Roswell in 1997, and June Crane knew that what was in that report was a lie, and she had some health problems at that time, and she decided to go forward to James Clarkson and tell him what she knew about this metal, about who showed her a sample of it, and she worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the time as a secretary, a very competent and well-respected secretary who could get jobs done, and she was shown this metal by an officer, and I think she was also told about bodies being taken there as well, as I recall. But what struck me about her account was this account of the memory metal. So I suggest that people read those accounts, and maybe they will conclude, as I have concluded, that yes, they did recover debris. Yes, it was debris which didn't look like anything that was in development by the US Air Force or any other terrestrial air force at the time. Therefore, where did it come from?
And what about the claims of the extraterrestrials live and dead?
Yeah, I mean,
or non-human beings, let's just call them that.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that a couple of times in the book. I don't give a lot of details about that. But again, people will claim that those stories came out later, which might be true. And I mentioned, for example, the testimony of Walter G. Haut, who was the Roswell press secretary. And initially, when he came out with his story, he didn't talk about having seen alien bodies. But again, as he approached the end of his life, he did write out an affidavit, but this I think wasn't released until about 3 or 4 or 5 years after he died. And he said that he'd been into a hangar and he'd witnessed the bodies, and that was in his signed affidavit. And again, I go into the criticism of that affidavit in the book, because some people have criticised it because it wasn't all written down at the same time or something. And so I'm aware of the criticisms of that. But overall, his account, based on some of the others' accounts, based on that evidence, I have concluded that yes, a disc did crash at Roswell, or at least one, maybe two, and that bodies were recovered, and that those materials and bodies were taken away and studied. They went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's a name that comes up more than once, not just in the Roswell case, it comes up in other cases as well.
And just to address the question of, well, why the hell would it crash? One explanation given is that there was an experimental radar system which was very powerful,
yes,
and putting out electromagnetic waves into the air, and obviously the propulsion system of such a disc is not using wings or aerodynamics. It's using something which is possibly affected by magnetics or electromagnetic waves. So
right,
I think Stanton Friedman has suggested this, that it may have been affected by some experimental radar system, and then possibly after they've realised this, they've then developed a weapon system for it.
Yes, and I mean this idea of using because radar technology is based on microwaves. You're sending out microwave beams. So this then ties into perhaps later use of the technology to, for example, eventually develop things like the active denial system for crowd control. And also there is some evidence that microwaves played some kind of role in the destruction of the World Trade Center. So you can see just in a general way that there may be a line of development which takes you from the events near Roswell right through to 9/11 potentially. Again, I'm skipping out and skipping over a lot of things and whatnot, but you can see that potential there, I think.
And we have another crash not far from there in 1948, alleged, the Aztec, 25th of March 1948, a place called Aztec, which is not far from the Roswell incident. And I think Stanton Friedman has suggested that, well, why are the craft appearing there in this one place? And he suggests that that's where there was nuclear research going on that they may have been concerned about. He doesn't know that, we don't know that, but he just puts that as a hypothesis. So what about this one? Yeah,
that's a great investigation. I read the book that I read was by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. They've written a couple of books actually. I think one was published in 2015, and that's the book that I read. I think it's just called The Aztec Incident. And that incident actually first came out in 1950 in Frank Scully's book, which was I think called Behind the UFOs. And it involved a chap called Silas Newton, who was quite a wealthy businessman. In the 1950s, there was a concerted effort to actually portray Silas Newton as a con man who was trying to con the government out of money because he had this device which could detect magnetic anomalies, and this had come from some type of UFO crash or something. But that whole story was essentially muddled together from what actually happened. And Scott and Suzanne Ramsey go into that in the book, how this story was developed and what originally happened. And they, for example, discovered this road in the middle of the desert, which they would state, based on the evidence they've collected, that this road was used to recover a crashed disc which had made, it wasn't like a catastrophic crash, it was like a forced landing. The disc had made a forced landing and like crashed into some rocks. And the occupants were killed. They've got witnesses. They went up to the craft, they opened the door, they went inside, they found the bodies, and then gradually they built up the evidence that yes, this disc had been recovered. This was when they built this road. The road is still there, you can go and find it. They found some concrete slabs which had been put on the road, which they think were to allow the crane to be put down so that they could lift this thing onto a truck. And they said
that's still there now.
That road is still there.
So
and
there's
that
no
slab is still
explanation
there.
for this road and concrete blocks
in the
just
middle
in the middle of the desert.
You know, there's no settlement there. There's no mine that's known of or anything like that. And you know, all that he goes into in the book in quite a lot of detail. He also talks about we talked about the radar. Now there was this claim that maybe this was brought down by radar, and I forget how he includes it in his account, but they said they came across this account that there was a radar base somewhere in that area, and they went around, but there's no Air Force base there. There is no Air Force base that would have built a radar facility. So everyone said, no, that's rubbish. There was no radar facility there because there's no air base. Why would they want to build a radar facility? But they kept on researching, and eventually they found that there was a radar base constructed there in the late 1940s, probably 47, maybe early 48. But the Air Force, it wasn't built for the Air Force, it was for Los Alamos National Laboratories, because it was built during the time, maybe it was the early 40s actually, I've got the date wrong, but it was built during the time that Los Alamos was working on the atomic bomb. And they needed to make sure that there were no enemy aircraft flying towards Los Alamos where they were doing the research. So they built this radar facility, but it wasn't for the Air Force. It was built for Los Alamos. And they found the site. You know, they went and they found where all the generators were installed, and they found the documents which showed that yes, this radar base had been built. So they worked through the story, and all the things that they told were not true about the case. A lot of them turned out that they actually were true, and they were able to find the evidence that they were true. So I came to the conclusion from their research, having studied it, that yes, indeed, a flying saucer disc crashed at Aztec in 1948, and a cover-up was done, and they did a better job of covering that crash up than they did of covering the Roswell crash up, because they were 6 months down the line and they'd learnt lessons from what happened with the Roswell case.
And you discussed a number of other cases. So there was 2 cases in a place called Socorro, one in 1964, and Kecksburg in 1965,
Yeah.
Shag Harbor in 1967, the Berwyn Mountains case in 1974, and I've made a film about that. You can watch it from this link. And the Rendlesham Forest case of 1980. So you mentioned that at the beginning, and I am going to be producing something hopefully quite soon with regards statement analysis of some of the witnesses. Do you want to say anything about Rendlesham in this interview?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you can read what I put in the book. Again, the chapter that you mentioned, it's quite short, but the point being that I recommend some of the literature you can read. For example, the Georgina Bruni book about the Rendlesham case, the Scott Ramsey book about Aztec, etc., etc. There's you can read the Chris Stiles book about the Shag Harbor incident from '67, where this craft went into the sea and divers went down to it whilst it was underwater. And then, I know I'm going back to this case, but I just wanted to mention briefly a bit about it. And then this craft moved, and it was observed for a period of about 2 days. Eventually it was, I think, observed for a period of time off the coast of Canada by the Canadian Navy, and it was observed for many hours under the water. And very few people are aware of this case. But going back to the Rendlesham case, you know, we'll probably have another conversation about this in the future, but, you know, there's been this, was it an alien craft or was it something else that landed? I think it's clear that something happened in the forest, something landed. There are a number of witnesses to that. But what actually landed and who it was owned by, whether it was an alien craft or not, I think that's the contentious issue, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's interesting that you said that the Navy tracked a UFO under the water.
Yeah.
Right? And obviously with the Aztec and the Roswell cases, if they hadn't been taken down somehow, possibly by radar, then they're just a dot in the sky. So people always ask the question, well, come on, if there's UFOs, everyone's got a high definition camera in their pocket these days. There would be pictures all over the internet of UFOs. So if we can just address that question, I don't think that that there's regular interaction or as regular as is claimed, right? But the first people to detect such incursions of either the ocean or the airspace is going to be the armed forces,
Yes.
and they're the ones running the radar systems.
Yes.
And we've got many reports of that in the Disclosure Project. I've had radar operators come to me in my lectures and tell me what they've seen, and they've been told not to speak about it, the right angle turns and impossible dynamics, etc. So do you just want to make a comment on the whole, the fact that there seems to be a lack of video evidence?
Yeah, I think certainly close-up evidence is rare, and as you say, it seems that some of these craft are wise to what's going on with our military forces, and they do steer clear a lot of the time. But as you say, the military are going to be able to detect these things. They're going to detect some. The Disclosure Project witnesses state that they can be tracked right out into space, from the Earth, so they can see them coming from a long way off. So they're going to be able to take action to put a cover-up in place, almost before anybody on the ground sees anything.
Well, there's the very interesting testimony of Michael Smith, where he gets a call. He's working, I'm not sure if he was working at NORAD or he had to telephone NORAD. No, I think he was working at a radar system that was in communication with NORAD, and they contacted him and they warned him that there was a UFO coming down. Could he make sure that there's no aircraft in the vicinity, because there's a UFO coming along that they had no control over.
And he said they told him not to write anything down, don't log it, just this is just happening.
Yeah. Now we don't know whether that was an extraterrestrial craft or whether it could have been a secret.
Aircraft,
it could have been a secret vehicle. Now you do mention some video evidence in your book. So you talk about NASA's own video evidence.
Oh yeah.
So just speak about that.
Well, I mean, again, anyone can look at what a good film to watch on that is the David Sarita analysis, which is called Evidence, the Case for NASA UFOs. That's on YouTube, I think, and it's quite old now. I think it's almost 20 years old. But he looks at several missions, for example, the STS-48 mission, the STS-80 mission, and the STS-75, the so-called tether incident, which are all space shuttle missions. Films all come from NASA. And to my knowledge, certainly in parts or more than one part of these clips, these are showing intelligently controlled craft. The one, I think it's STS-48, which was the one where this beam is apparently fired and the craft shoots off in a different direction. Questions were asked about that in the US Congress at the time, and Jack Kasher, who was a PhD physicist, he wrote about that. And I think I discussed that in the Secret Space Program book, actually, in this book. So these three books that I mentioned in there are kind of almost a trilogy focusing around these subjects. But it is clear that NASA do have it's clear to me at least, that NASA do have some video evidence of intelligently controlled craft operating near the Earth.
That are not claimed to belong to NASA.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I was interested in your write-up of Professor Robert Jacobs' experiences. So this guy was involved in testing nuclear missiles, and in particular, because when they do a missile test, they need to observe it. And in order to do that, they need special optics. So this guy was involved in this very precise telescope that could track something at a particular distance,
yes,
and get a visual image on a camera of a missile, right?
Right.
So, and he's stuck by his story, and you've actually met him.
Yes.
He stuck by. He was a Disclosure Project witness,
correct,
as well, and he got a lot. Well, he got death threats, didn't he, to stop talking about his story. So do you want to give an outline of that story, Andrew?
Yes, absolutely. I advise people to watch his testimony, which isn't very long. It's only like about 5 minutes, the core testimony, where he said that, as you say, he was involved in this project where they had a radar tracking telescope with a very long focal length, and it had a tracking mount, and they had to film a missile test with all three stages of powered flight, going out from Vandenberg Air Force Base, from where this missile was apparently launched. And they were up on this hillside, pre-planned location, and they were tracking this object with a telescope which could film, which had film in it, as a film camera attached. Obviously an expensive piece of equipment. And they managed to successfully film this test with this missile. And then he got called in the next day at the base at Vandenberg, and he was his superior, Major Mansman, Sonny Mansman, said, "Watch the film."
We got all 3 stages of powered flight, and as the dummy warhead and the package flew on down range, we were all celebrating the fact that we had seen the thing and accomplished the mission. When I got back to the base with the film the next day, I was called into the office of Major Florence J. Mansman, and there were 3 people in gray suits standing in there. There was a 16mm camera and a screen set up. Major Mansman said, "Lieutenant, sit down and watch this." And he turned down the lights, turned on the camera on the projector, and the film came on. And I recognized it as the film that we'd shot at Big Sur the previous day. Toward the end of the flight, I was looking at Major Mansman saying, "Pretty good stuff, huh, sir?" And suddenly he said, "Just watch this." And as I watched, the warhead, the dummy warhead, the chaff that was put out in front of it as the decoy to deflect the Russian anti-missile tracking radar, everything was flying along, and suddenly, in the same direction this stuff was flying at about 8,000 miles an hour, an object came into the frame, shot a beam of light at the warhead, flew up to the top, shot another beam of light at the warhead, flew around the direction it was flying, shot another beam of light at the warhead, flew down, shot another beam of light at the warhead, and flew out the same way it came in.
Well, I don't understand. Why didn't you see this when you were shooting it?
Well, it was 600 to 800 miles away from us.
Oh, I got you. And they confiscated.
Well, first of all, Major Mansman said to me, "What was that? Were you guys screwing around up there?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Then tell me what that was." And I said, "We got a UFO." And he said, "Lieutenant, you are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this didn't happen."
And then that film was taken away by some plainclothes people, and he was told not to speak of the incident again. He didn't say it was top secret. He was told not to speak of it again. So he didn't speak of it for about 26 years. I think he spoke about it first publicly in 1982. I think the event happened in the mid-60s. And so, did he make that story up? And then somebody actually followed up and they tracked down this Major Mansman, Sonny Mansman, and they asked him whether the story was true, and he confirmed the details in a letter. And that, copies of that letter are on the web. It's not. So there we have an example, and this has been written about extensively by people like Robert Hastings, who's written a book called UFOs and Nukes. You can hear many interviews of Professor Robert Jacobs on the internet.
So Professor Robert Jacobs.
Yeah, Bob Jacobs, yeah.
Yeah. So why isn't our friend that we spoke about at the beginning, who wrote you that email, who says, well, we're only going to look at radio waves from distant stars. So I guess our friend Seth would just say, well, he's not a scientist, so I'm not going to believe a word he's saying.
Yeah.
Yes. So, and he also spoke about the death threats that he had to stop talking about this in public. He did, yes. So his mailbox was blown up, and Philip Glass wrote to his university once he told this story about the UFOs, and he was fired from that job. Robert Jacobs was fired from his university job because of a letter that Philip Glass had written, and he goes into some detail about that. We've been suggesting so far that some of these UFO events are just man-made technology. It's hard to put that one down to man-made technology. So the US are testing a missile. Why would some group send a highly advanced object to go and fight? Well, firstly, catch up with the missile and run alongside it, fire a beam, and then go around the other side. So it had dynamics which was way outperforming the missile in terms of speed and changes of direction, etc. Why would a secret group want to do that? A secret man-made group. Why wouldn't they just have intelligence? Oh well, yeah, it's just a missile test. We don't need to be worried about that. Yeah, that's it. So, when you get into some of these cases, it's more difficult to say, well, that was just black technology. It wasn't an extraterrestrial group. If that incident is true as reported by Professor Robert Jacobs, and I have no reason to doubt the veracity of his account because it's backed up by another person as well, independently, that to me does lend support to the fact that it was an alien
group, an alien craft that was doing that. It wasn't anything that belonged to any group on Earth.
All right. Well, let's turn our attention to Wilbert Smith, from skeptic to contactee. So he's somebody who you hold in very high regard.
I do, yes.
So tell us about him, Andrew.
I can't remember if we've discussed him on previous programmes, but in summary, Wilbert Smith was a Canadian radio engineer, and he held 37 patents when he died. He died in 1962 of cancer of the lower bowel, and he became the superintendent of radio regulations in Canada, and he was involved in setting up the radio network for the Canadian war effort. So he was a knowledgeable guy, and he built some hardware. He built a magnetic sync circuit, he built a binding meter, and he built a special coil. And when he switched this coil on and powered it, according to instructions he was given by the boys topside, these are supposedly these group of aliens that were circling the Earth and in contact with somebody called Francis Swan for a period of time. This coil that he designed, he put I think a kilowatt of power into this coil, and nothing came out of it. He couldn't get any measurable output, and he was told by this group that when he did that, he was creating this tensor energy, as they called it. But as an engineer, he couldn't explain how this coil could possibly be doing what it did. And he was exactly the sort of guy who would know exactly what this coil should have done, because he was qualified to do that. He did it for his job, And you can read the Wilbert Smith story on Grant Cameron's website, and I made a video about that as well. Grant Cameron did an audio about it. It's quite a few years old now. So I recommend that people study the Wilbert Smith story separately. And, my conclusion was that, yes, indeed, he was talking to non-human intelligences. They were giving him some valid information about technological items which he designed and built and tested. And that then, at least in part, takes us back into something I discussed in a previous program, which is he also built an experiment which was to do with changing the force of gravity using a spinning disk, and that I discussed in the Finding the Secret Space Program book. So again,
and Wilbert Smith had connections to the higher echelons of the Canadian government.
He did.
He was a government employee.
He was superintendent of radio regulations, and he went to the US quite a lot as well. And he's well known for this thing I didn't mention a couple of minutes ago, was the 1950 top secret memo, which is where he said that the UFO subject is more highly classified in the US than the atomic bomb project.
I've got that quote here.
Yeah.
So he was not just a radio enthusiast. He was rubbed shoulders with people high up in the American government when he would visit from Canada.
Correct.
Yeah? American officials. So he states that he's talking about the UFO subject. The matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the hydrogen bomb. Flying saucers exist. Their modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance.
And that going back to the general disclosure issue, that information came out in a government memo in 1950, which wasn't declassified until 1979. And that is a direct statement from Smith, a Canadian government minister, that the UFO issue, the flying saucer issue, was being investigated by the US government in 1950, the late 40s, 1950s. To me, that's one of the strongest, bits of disclosure that we've ever had in an official government document. Yet it is, now approaching 70 years old. And I don't think we've had anything. I would argue that we haven't really had anything that's as significant as that in the past 70 years.
All right. Now, let's come on to the less physical aspect. All right. So why do you think metaphysics is important to understanding UFOs? Because this is something that Wilbert Smith also wrote about or spoke about.
Yes, I mean, again, it's best if you listen to this 18-minute speech that he made in Ottawa in 1958, and I made I've got a YouTube video about that. But he basically says that to understand what's going on with the UFO issue, you do have to have a bit of a knowledge about things like what science is, what religion is, what consciousness is, and how we as human beings experience the universe, if you will, if I can put it like that. He came to realise that those sorts of considerations were very important if you truly wanted to understand, you know, what the UFO phenomena was about. And even in that top secret memo, he talks about the Americans needing help with the UFO issue in relation to what he called mental phenomena. And he wrote that in 1950. So in other words, when you talk about telepathy and psychics and stuff like that, I think that's what he was alluding to. He doesn't openly state that. So you've got to ask yourself, we've changed tack slightly here, but I do think it's related, what the US was doing, for example, in the 1960s and 70s with this Operation Stargate, where they were trying to sort of use psychics to help with military operations in one way, and eventually that turned into the remote viewing program, you know, and so that, I think, does have a connection to the UFO issue, and that's still not talked about very much in the mainstream UFO movement, that there is some type of psychic element to the UFO phenomenon.
All right, now we're going to come on to ancient alleged astronauts a little bit later. And one quote from your book, I'm not sure who this comes from, but I think this is an interesting one. The human race, in the form of man, extends throughout the universe and is incredibly ancient. So that then also ties in with the human origin subject,
Correct.
which we'll also come on to, because mainstream science suggests that DNA started in a puddle on the planet about 4 billion years ago, and then morphed into single cell life, and then gradually, so the absolute start of man was on the earth.
And we are all slime plus time.
Slime plus time.
That's what we are.
And this is what another question that you'll hear skeptics say, which is, well, you know, how come they've got 2 arms and 2 legs and are a bit like us then?
Yeah.
Or the Nordic alien, how come they're like us? Well, if they'd evolved elsewhere, then they would be entirely different. Well, no, that's based on an assumption.
It is, yes.
That all life evolved only from the Earth. And as many researchers will contend that life was probably brought here in some form and possibly in various stages.
The quote that you read there is actually, again, the tail end of what Wilbert Smith said.
Right.
That's what he says in that 18-minute address. And as you highlighted it there, that to me struck a chord because of what we've talked, the sorts of topics you were just mentioning right there, which of course is to do with what Lloyd Pye said in his books, and of course Zecharia Sitchin, which maybe we'll go on to. But
so I mean, you could define that as linked to the UFO cover-up then, the whole science of
human origins,
human origins, and the flawed evolution mainstream hypothesis.
Yes, yes, I think that is another aspect of why they want to keep the alien issue sort of covered up, because when you get to some of the core details, it does challenge some of the scientific establishment in relation to human origins.
And there's a halfway house in it. I forget the guy's name. He's a professor. I think he spoke at the Exopolitics conference once.
Chandra Wickman.
So his halfway house hypothesis is that yes, it started in a puddle, but the first block of DNA, or the very, very early pre-life sort of building blocks landed from a comet. Not suggesting is that higher forms of life have been brought here. Yeah, that's not in his theory.
No,
which
he was mainly talking about forms of bacteria and
right.
and those sorts of
So it's just a slight variation on the everything started in a puddle argument. It's suggesting that there's not higher forms of life elsewhere like us in the universe. It's all covered in Lloyd Pye's latest book, isn't it?
It is,
the one
yes.
he wrote just before he died.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is called
Everything You Know Is Still Wrong.
Everything You Know Is Still Wrong. We have spoken about that book.
Yes.
We'll come on to that subject a bit later. So obviously you go into the whole contactee and abductee subject, and you state that they make recurring claims on the ET issue, which you're a little bit sceptical about. So
Some of them definitely, yeah.
I'm just going to list them. So this is what people who claim to have contacted aliens report generally. That the ETs are here as observers. The ETs are here as guides. The ETs are here to upgrade humans in some way. ETs tell us that human beings must raise their consciousness. ETs tell us that human consciousness is evolving rapidly and we will start to function in higher dimensions. Human beings must become more aware of the environmental damage they or other agencies are causing and must work to protect the Earth. Some ETs were exiled here and have interfered with human development over centuries and even interbred with Homo sapiens at various times. And you've listed various contactees, George Adamski,
Yep.
Billy Meyer, Howard Menger, Sixto Paz
Wells, yeah.
Sixto Paz Wells, Dr. George King. You mentioned Dr. George King of the Aetherius Society.
Yeah.
SETI spelt S-E-T-I, and then there's E-SETI, E-C-E-T-I, which is it George Gilliland?
James Gilliland, yeah.
James Gilliland, and then there's C-SETI, which is Stephen Greer's organisation,
Yes.
which tries to make telepathic contact with extraterrestrials. The contactees are told to be worried about nuclear and environmental concerns, and that this is probably your biggest bone of contention with the
Yes.
contactees, is that they don't seem to be concerned about directed energy weapons, which we know destroyed the World Trade Center towers.
Right.
So why aren't contactees spreading messages about that?
Right.
And those two agendas, to be worried about nuclear or environmental concerns, could tie in with certain human beings' agendas.
They could. You know, I mean, again, I haven't heard any contactees talking specifically about the events of 9/11, just to expand on what you said there a little bit. And none of the UFO researchers are talking about the events of 9/11 in a kind of, how can I put it, in a global context as to what effect 9/11 has had on the whole planet in the way that, say, nuclear weapons, the development of nuclear weapons had on the whole planet. I haven't heard any of the UFO contactees, alien contactees, or any of the researchers discussing that. So in other words, it's like, well, the way I look at that is, well, how is it then that these superior alien intelligences talking to these people, they don't appear to know things that I can know from reading Dr. Judy Wood's book, you know, and we're now 18 years on from 9/11. So if there was some kind of delay between that theme coming up, you know, in the contactee community, you know, that it's a long delay.
So it's as if the aliens only know about white world science and not black world science.
Right, that's kind of what I'm saying.
You kind of expect them to know about the black world science, wouldn't you?
And why they're not naming names? You know, why they're not saying, well, it's these sorts of companies that you know should be.
Yeah, if they're advising their contactees, right, you've got to save the planet, you'd think they'd give them a bit more help.
Yeah.
Well, you need to go to that building, you need to arrest him, you need to stop this person doing that. A bit more direction.
Right.
A bit less woolly thinking.
A bit less woolly thinking. I think if we can put it like that, you know, of course, the people that are sympathetic to these contactee sort of ideals might say, oh, well, you know, they're only here to guide. They can't name specific people. They can't interfere. Which I think there is some truth to that. Don't get me wrong. And I'm not by making these points that we're making at this here, I'm not saying that I disbelieve all the contactee stories. Quite the contrary. In fact, you know, from what Wilbert Smith said, I feel that he was in contact with extraterrestrial intelligences, but that was back in the 1960s. And my feeling is that, again, like the military-industrial complex have interfered with other things, like, you know, the development of free energy technology, they're also interfering with the contactee phenomenon. That's essentially what I say in the book, that they're putting their own spin on it and maybe controlling and manipulating that to quite a large degree.
Yeah. The problem with the contactee phenomenon, we're not suggesting that there aren't people who have are in contact with non-human intelligences. We're not saying
I'm not saying that.
We're saying that there's an agenda, which a human agenda, which can drive the whole alien contactee field.
Yes, and I think we're going to get onto it a little bit, but that I give evidence for what you've just said in the later parts of the book, in that how that agenda, is overlaid on top of the contactee phenomenon, and it is manipulated by some of the UFO researchers themselves.
Yeah.
Deliberately, knowingly.
Yeah. And perhaps that ties into what is referred to as MILAB, military abductions. So that the military can abduct people in the same way that extraterrestrials are alleged to do, and mind control people, what have you. So just spell out why, because you have military themes come up in some abductees' testimonies, and you've spoken about that.
Yes, there's a couple of, I think there's one and a bit chapters or so on that. A particular case that I focus on is the Leah Haley case from around about the early 2000s, late 90s. And she's this abductee who originally thought that she was being abducted by aliens, and then she got involved with this case where it was alleged that she was in this craft and it was operating in the Gulf Breeze area of Florida, and that she was in this craft actually crashed on a beach or something. And this was then later a trigger to her discovering that her experiences, her abduction experiences, weren't really with aliens, but it was some type of military mind control program. And she ended up, after several years of research, thinking that she hadn't really been abducted by aliens. She was actually part of some type of MK Ultra type of program. Mm-hmm. And she came to this conclusion on her own, She was involved with this hypnotist called John Carpenter. And she later found out that he actually sold his case files to Robert Bigelow of NIDS, and who claimed to be investigating the UFO issue at the time. So in other words, all these confidential files where she'd had regression sessions with John Carpenter, that was all sold to Robert Bigelow. So why would Bigelow want such documents anyway? And this, I think, was when Leah Haley realised there was another thing going on behind the scenes with how her case was being investigated. And of course, we can then question what people like Robert Bigelow's role really is in investigating the UFO phenomena. If he's collecting reports from people like Leah Haley, who's then later saying she was involved in military abductions. And I bring in a couple of other cases in the book, and there's a researcher called Barbara Bartolik and Carla Turner. You can read their books to learn more about this angle. I mentioned those books in my book as well, and it's worth looking at what they said.
There are a long list of people who investigate the alien abduction phenomenon, and the main method that they use is hypnotic regression. Now, one problem with that is that an experienced hypnotist could put someone under and plant UFO or alien stories into a subject and make them believe it. I'm not suggesting that any or all of them do that. I'm just saying that, well, evidence from hypnotic regression is not necessarily reliable.
Yes, yeah, I think that there's a big question mark there. I think you can look at it and see what comes out of it, but I think it's more difficult to draw any firm conclusions. I mean, again, it's interesting when I think, for example, what occurs in Carla Turner's book is she gets information from widely separated witnesses who seem to tell the same story, and they may have been hypnotized by different hypnotists. So I think when you get that sort of information coming out independently in different sessions done by different hypnotists, that would lead to the suggestion that yes, there is something really going on there, and it's not just that they're being fed information, because each hypnotist would do it differently.
So you mention Aleister Crowley's drawing of an entity, and was Aleister Crowley suggesting that was from another planet, or it's just another dimension, or where's the entity from?
He was suggesting it was some type of demonic entity of some kind, or some entity that, right. I don't think he talked about its origin. It was this entity called Lamb, and several people have made the observation that this drawing of Lamb, which is in one of Aleister Crowley's books or papers that he'd written, looks like a grey alien. So
just for those who don't know, Aleister Crowley is, well, How do you summarise Aleister Crowley?
He was described, I think, as Britain's most evil man, I think, at one time.
Well, he was interested in black magic.
Yes.
Or ways of changing human consciousness through
occult rituals
and various sexual practices, or in order to access parts of consciousness that we can't reach, and perhaps communicate with non-physical entities.
Yes.
Or deities, using various techniques, and people compare the abduction scenario with a demonic experience scenario, and we'll then get into an argument over, well, all the alien abduction cases, they're being visited by a demonic entity.
Yes.
Have you got a thought on that?
Yeah, well, I do mention that, and one of the things I mentioned in the book is the studies of Rick Strassman, who wrote this book called The Spirit Molecule, where he actually did clinical studies with DMT, dimethyltryptamine, in the early 90s, and he had to get special government permission to do this. And he injected his subjects with DMT with a measured dosage. And some of them actually reported experiences which were indistinguishable from alien abductions in many respects. So I mentioned that in the book, and how, for example, if we have got this situation where the military is taking people and abducting them, what if in some cases they injected them with DMT and it gave them this experience that it was aliens that were abducting them? You know, I don't know if that's true, but I'm just opening up that as a possibility. And I don't think I do quote another study in the book, which was done a few years ago, I think in the year 2000, by I think a psychology student. He'd written it for either an MSc thesis or an end of course dissertation, where he talks about the commonality with the alien abduction experience with what are called shamanic experiences, which are spiritual experiences which are important to certain tribes which live in the Amazon jungle, for example, where shamanism is essentially, it's not really a religion. I think that's false to cause it that, but that's about closest I can. Shamanism is an integral part of their culture, and how they actually, instead of praying to God, for example, they would go and see a shaman and consult with him, and he'd have a shamanic vision to give them advice. And that there is some tie-in between those sorts of experiences and the alien abduction experience, if you read that paper that I referenced. And
this shaman would use drugs in order to induce
to induce an altered state of consciousness.
Right. You mentioned Whitley Strieber, who's another name that crops up in the UFO field. I got the impression that you're not that impressed with his work. Is that or? Well,
I think his first book on the subject, Communion, is very interesting. But again, it gets into was this just him being part of a military psychological operation, an abduction experience? Again, you're back to sort of, I think with the Whitley Strieber account, it's very similar to the Leah Haley account. There's a lot of similarities there. Right. And she eventually concluded that it wasn't aliens doing it.
Right.
So the same might be true for Whitley Strieber. I suppose.
Right. And he might not know it.
Correct. Or he might not have accepted it.
Right. Yeah, or he might have not known it in the first place, realises it now and doesn't want to go back on it.
Maybe. I mean, I haven't communicated with him, so, I didn't discuss it a lot in the book, but I do just mention it as another of these cases which it involves aggressive aliens, performing medical procedures and abusing him and others physically, claiming that it's, they have some higher agenda, which, is their motivation for doing it.
Right. Now, one case which you think is probably the most, or one of the most concrete abduction cases, is Travis Walton, who you've met and been to conferences with, and you know his story in a lot of detail.
Yes.
So I'll just read what you've written here.
Okay.
Conclusion, the case of Travis Walton is, as far as I am concerned, that's Andrew, it's important because it shows us that mechanical craft with advanced propulsion systems have visited the Earth, that different alien races are working together in some way, unless of course we are dealing with some type of robot in some of these cases. They are able to take us into their craft, and they seem to understand our physiology. At least some of these beings have a benign nature. Right, so do you want to just expand on, so you think that that's what Alan Godfrey as well, but you think that's what the Travis Walton case?
Yes, I mean, if you read his book, Fire in the Sky, you can watch the film if you want, but the abduction sequence in the film from 1993 is totally unlike what happened to Walton. But he describes meeting these one type of being. They don't attack him, they don't stick things in him. Once he wakes up in this craft, they sort of go out of the room, and he gets up, he's a bit of a dazed state, goes out into another room, and he meets this human-looking alien, and then eventually he's taken out of the craft into what appears to be a larger room or a larger craft, and these two humanoid aliens pacify him, and then he wakes up on the ground, on the road, about 6 miles or 12 miles outside the town where he lived. And that's all those facts are pretty well documented from the police record and interviews with police, and the witnesses all tell the same story. There were 5 witnesses to him disappearing. So it appears that he was injured in the incident where he jumps out of the truck and the beam comes out of the craft and impacts on his body. And my interpretation, and to an extent his is as well, he's tried to remain as neutral as possible about what happened to him. He just reported the incident as experienced by him and his friends. But I basically think he's a sound observer of sound mind. He reports what he did and what he said accurately, and without trying to embellish it. He's never embellished his story. He's always told the same story. He recalled a few extra details, having been hypnotised, but again, he was hypnotised, but all that happened in his hypnosis was that he was able to recall the details with it. He didn't get stressed about it. He had less anxiety, but he didn't recall any extra information under hypnosis. So even with hypnosis, his story didn't change. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think his case is very significant and quite different to most of the other abduction cases.
Right.